guys, what is up? My name is Megan. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. I hope you guys are doing well and staying safe. And welcome to today's video, which is basically an advice video on how to get out of a reading slump. I have been meaning to make this video for a really long time because I do think that I have some pretty good tips on how to manage to get out of a reading slump, because I've been in my fair share of reading slumps throughout the past few years. Now I thought it'd be fitting to put my shirt that says "Take care of yourself," because getting out of a reading slump is all about that. So without further ado, let's go into my list of ways to get out of a reading slump. So my number one tip to get out of a reading slump is that if you are currently reading a book and that this book is leading you to be in your reading slump, you should DNF it. Now that can be a soft DNF if you're scared of like saying I will DNF this book forever. You can softly DNF it, put it back on your shelf, and revisit it at a later time. If you're like me and you absolutely do not care about DNFing books forever, DNF it. Not every book is going to be for you, and you need to understand that, because you can give something a try and that's great. But if it's not for you at this current time or ever, it's not a bad thing to just stop reading. It is not a bad thing at all. DNFs are a great way to go. Now, after DNFing, or if you don't want to DNF, here are other ways to get you out of a reading slump. One of my tips is definitely to change out the format you are reading it. If you are like me and you are a more like physical reading girly, try switching up either for an audiobook or an ebook. You can even do that with the actual version of the book you're reading right now. So for example, if you're reading a book physically, you can always try to get the audiobook to kind of get you back into the groove of reading, make going through that book easier if you didn't want to DNF it. Or you can just totally ignore that book or start a book if you weren't reading and just try a different format than usual. When I read on my Kindle, I always feel incredibly productive because I read at a faster pace, and sometimes that's all it takes to kind of get me out of a slump, is just to make myself feel productive again. Sometimes I'll pop in an audiobook and do some housework or some other things at the same time, color, play a video game, and so it makes the chore of reading less daunting. My third tip is actually to reread, and I feel like it's one of these tips that everybody's like, just reread a book, but it actually does work. Now a reread can be like rereading one of your childhood favorites, it can be rereading one of your favorite books, rereading something you read on like a freaking fandom website, on whatever you want, because sometimes rereading will spur that love of reading again, and it will kind of get you hyped for books, and then you'll be in the mood to read again, and it's just a very comforting feeling as well. Sometimes when we're reading slumps for a long period of time, we kind of second guess if we still love reading, if something's wrong with us, and then going back to one of our favorites kind of alleviates that stress and that pressure, and I feel like it really works for me. And sometimes you can combine two of my tips, which is rereading something in a different format from the last time you've read it. For example, if you were not new here, you would know that my favorite book ever is Listen to Your Heart by Casey West, for its comfort vibes. Am I saying this is the best book of all time? No. However, when I am feeling anxious, when I am feeling sad, if I just have a bad day, or if I'm in a slump, I will always revisit this book. Now, sometimes I pick this book up physically, but sometimes I also revisit it via audiobook just to calm myself. And I will say, sometimes I just pick this up and reread some of my favorite chapters, put it down again, and I'm good to go. Other times I do a full read through. So if sometimes just picking up a book to revisit some of your favorite scenes with your favorite characters is something you feel you can do, it is enough to kind of get you in that reading mood again. And for me, this one works like an absolute charm. Tip number 4 is actually to use social media to your advantage, and I don't mean doom scrolling. What I do mean, however, is going to your favorite content creators or favorite content platforms, whether that be YouTube or TikTok, Instagram, and looking at bookish things. Usually when I scroll on TikTok, I see a lot of book things, obviously, and it usually motivates me to read like nothing else. I see people get excited about their favorite books or books they've received in the mail, or just talk about books, and the excitement is just so genuine and real that it oftentimes put me in a mood to read. And so I think that sometimes if you're not feeling it, if you're feeling uninspired by reading, going and looking at your favorite creators and listening to them talk about their favorite books will help you get into a mindset of reading again, and it's just a very wholesome feeling, and I recommend it very much. The next tip I have is to actually motivate yourself by giving yourself little rewards or just taking reading into a different kind of mindset. Now, when I get in a reading slump and it feels very daunting to read a book, what I will do is I will give myself small goals and mark them off. So for example, I will take a book and then I will put like post-it tabs at different chapters, and I'll give myself a goal, for example, to read past through post-its, and then I can put down the book. And usually by the time this happens, I have tricked my brain into wanting to keep reading, and so I just do, and eventually it kind of gets me back into the mood. And sometimes just seeing the progress like physically, so whether that be on post-its or by updating your Goodreads or your story graph, when you make little dents into your book, will motivate you. For example, if you see that you were at 20% and you made it to 25 or 30% of the way through the book, it will kind of get you wanting to read more. At least it does for me. It's an old trick of mine. I really love updating my Goodreads and my story graph as I read a book. I will update it multiple times to see where I'm at percentage wise, and it's really helpful, kind of like when you see on your Kindle that you have X amount of time left in a chapter or on audio, and you're like, okay, like I'm getting close to the end of the chapter, let me finish that off. I think it kind of helps you get through a book if you're in a slump, and it definitely tricks your mind into wanting to continue reading. Again, with the kind of like productivity feelings about reading, I sometimes like to read a short book or a graphic novel or something of the sorts, just to kind of make me feel productive again and make me realize that reading is not so hard, because sometimes I feel like my slumps are mostly because I feel overwhelmed by life. I'm exhausted by work, I'm exhausted by everything else I have to do, and so reading feels like this huge, very daunting experience. But being able to kind of shorten the length of a book, so going for a novella, going for a short story, going for a manga or a graphic novel, it just kind of makes reading easier instead of going for like that 800-page fantasy book. And so sometimes just reintroducing yourself to reading in a slower and kinder pace will do the trick. Another thing I like to do is switch up the genres I am reading to make sure I don't get in a reading slump. So this is more of a tip to prevent a slump, but I am a reader who reads very specific genres. I am not, well, yes and no. I have my preferred genres, and I usually gravitate whether towards romance, middle grade, or I guess sometimes fantasy or literary fiction. But usually it's romance and middle grade, and so to make sure that I don't burn out from reading one genre, I will usually read sometimes 1 or 2 romance books and then go into a middle grade, at least read a middle grade, and then switch back to another genre, just to make sure I'm not tiring myself out. Because as much as I love romance and I love middle grade books, I feel like these books are somewhat repetitive. Like, obviously there's just so many ways you can write a book, and there's just so many tropes you can use, and so sometimes I feel like I get burnt out on a specific book trope or a vibe of a book, or I just am not in the mood for a romance or middle grade or whatever. And so it's easier for me to make sure that I rotate throughout the genres I read to make sure I don't get burnt out and then not want to read. So I feel like it's an excellent way to make sure that you are not burning yourself out. Find at least like 2 genres that you're comfortable reading and switch through them. Next tip I have is to shop your shelves. Now, sometimes I feel like I get overwhelmed because there's just so many books online, so many people talk about so many books, and then I kind of have this like paralyzing fear that I'm like, I'm never gonna read everything, like I don't know what I want to read, I cannot make a decision, and then I start to panic and I just never pick up a book because I don't know what I'm in the mood for. But what I've started doing is looking at my shelves like I would an aisle in a bookstore, and just peruse some books, take the time to like shop my shelves, read descriptions, go back and look at older books I have on my shelves, and just kind of feel it out, and then pick something from the mood I am in. If you are someone who does specific TBRs, sometimes letting yourself mood read and shop your shelf will definitely help with reducing that paralyzing fear of choosing something and committing to a book, because you're gonna feel so inspired after browsing for 10-15 minutes if you have a bigger collection, going through a bunch of different choices and just getting hyped for all the books you own will make you want to read. Another tip I have is to try a chapter. You know those try a chapter tags where people sit down and they read the first chapter of a bunch of books? I highly recommend doing that if you were in a slump, because sometimes it takes time to find a book that you're like, yes, this caught my attention, this is it, this is what we're doing. And so you can pick out, for example, if you're in a mood for like a thriller, pick out 5 thrillers if you have 5 on your bookshelf, or look at your library or those kinds of things and read the first chapter of each one. And then usually what happens is there's a line or a chapter that grips you, and then you just kind of keep reading. And I feel like that's another excellent way to trick your mind, because you're just going in for a chapter, but then you might end up staying and reading more of that book. And my last tip is actually to tab or annotate your books, because it will keep you very focused. Now, sometimes when I'm not in a very big mood to read, it kind of seems daunting to annotate or tab, and I understand that, but sometimes you just need to push through and just make reading an intention and something that you are putting energy into, and specifically like just that this is what you're doing, you're not doing anything else, and you just kind of have to do it. And so while annotating or tabbing, you keep your focus much more on the book and not the outside world and not your phone, and it kind of helps suck you into a story. And I found that it has helped, and it gotten me through some books sometimes, and it's just, I feel, a tip that works for me. I don't know how well I sold you guys on this tip, but you should try it if you're desperate and you're in a reading slump. But ultimately, what I have to say is that sometimes you just need to give yourself time and take care of yourself and be gentle with yourself. We are going through so many different seasons of life, and sometimes that season of life does not include reading, and that's okay. When I was finishing my bachelor's degree, I did not have the time, the energy to read, and I just let myself not read. And once that period of my life was done, I binge read a bunch of books, and that's kind of how it is. It will ebb and flow, and you just have to be gentle with yourself and realize that reading is a hobby, and that you should just do it when it feels right. Obviously, sometimes we want to get like through it, and that's where my tips come in. But just be kind to yourself and remember that it's okay if you read 1 book in a year, if you read nothing at all, or if you read 20 books in a month. And to each their own, and just remember that, you know, reading is a great escape, and if it's not what is helping you escape right now, then you'll eventually come back to it, and that's okay. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you very soon with another video. I hope this one was helpful. Bye guys, happy reading.